Director of Education at the Hudson River Museum, and it is my pleasure to introduce today's program, Sketchbook Traveler, a virtual workshop series with James McElhinney. Whether it's sunny out or rainy out or windy out or whatever, I hope you are enjoying your day. And again, thank you for spending part of it with us. What had been a medium solely for map makers and naturalists, watercolor painting has become the most portable medium for both artists and enthusiasts. Plein air watercolor journaling transforms the sketchbook into something more nimble than canvas. Anyone can enhance how they experience the natural world by generating memories, knowledge, and ideas through drawing and writing in journals. Author, educator, historian, and journal painter, James McElhinney, has been leading this 5-part series of workshops and lectures inspired by the exhibition Landscape Art and Virtual Travel, highlights from the collections of the HRM and Art Bridges, in which participants have been invited to develop their skills for mindful travel through journaling, geared toward adults at different levels of proficiency. I want to mention that our thanks go out to Art Bridges for sponsoring today's program and, in fact, the entire series. So today, we are joining the intrepid sketchbook explorer at yet another mystery location, somewhere within the North Country or the Hudson Valley. The artist will lead this mindful virtual painting demo, sharing his unique sites and artistic challenges. We will talk more about the final session later, which will be coming up on Wednesday, August 4th at 1:30, and that will be another virtual program, and it will be a critique session. So everyone, please note that your microphones have been muted upon entry, although you can control your video camera. And let's see, do we have closed captioning today? Not today. Okay, just wanted to check. We are also inviting you all to submit your questions, comments, or concerns by typing them in the chat during the course of the conversation, and the artist will respond. We anticipate the program will run about 60 to 90 minutes. Now it's my honor to introduce James Lancel McElhinney, a visual artist, author, independent scholar, and fine press publisher. He holds an MFA in painting from Yale and a BFA from the Tyler School of Art. McElhinney is the recipient of fellowships and grants, including a 2017 Pollock-Krasner grant and a prior visual artist fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts. McElhinney is the author of Sketchbook Traveler, Hudson Valley, the first in a series of books produced by Schiffer Publishing. His work was recently exhibited here at the Hudson River Museum in James McElhinney, Discover the Hudson Anew. And his work may be found here in numerous public collections, including the Albany Institute of History and Art, West Point Museum, New York Public Library, as well as the Hudson River Museum. So I think it is now time to turn the program over to James. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah Linda.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can everybody see me? Am I on speaker view? What are we doing? We have gallery view, speaker view.
Let me spotlight. You've been spotlighted, so no matter what view they are in, they will be able to see you, James.
Well, thanks for being here. Yeah, today, as is occasionally to be expected, the venue where I had planned to, from which I had planned to present this program, was suddenly off limits as the town that owns the park decided to have an event with a lot of screaming kids, and so and that together with the fact that it's raining a little bit and the weather doesn't look like it's going to become any more cooperative, I've I've moved to the exotic location of my dining room table. Now, I should say a few things in preparation. One is that while Sarah Linda used the word plein air, I think plein air painting is a wonderful thing. This is not exactly what we're doing. We're doing journaling, and we're doing sort of mindful engagement with nature through drawing and painting. It's not not to be confused with a very popular plein air movement. I'm really more interested in trying to revitalize an expeditionary practice that was in use a couple hundred years ago, and was very, very helpful in building people's understanding of the terrain and the natural world around them. So to that end, I'm interested in the science, in the history, and in the anecdotal character of a place, and not just merely the technical means required to produce an optically satisfying picture of what I'm looking at. So think about some of the English military officers in the 18th century who were right here where I am. I'm in the Champlain Valley of upstate New York. And it's not really widely known, but right at the end of the French and Indian War, a lot of English military officers traveled around North America and produced a series of images that were later elaborated as engravings and published under the title of Scenographia Americana in 1768, fully 6 years before the British public saw any of the images from Claude Lorraine's Liber Veritatis. So now artists might have known about Claude, but most of the public didn't. And of course, the Liber Veritatis was a book that he made of his compositions to try to vet his work and to discredit imitators. And he started it when he was about 30 years old and continued till he died in 1682. But it was in the property of the Duke of Devonshire, who in 1774 decided that he was going to allow it to be published, reproduced and published as etchings and mezzotints. And so it really wasn't until then that Claude hit the scene in a big way. So you could say that pictures of North America actually were known to the British public before images by Claude Lorraine, even though he died 100 years earlier. So as I've been studying all of this, a lot of my ideas about landscape have been sort of overturned. And I think a lot of the assumptions that we all make about what landscape painting is and what it's about have been overturned. And so I have to say that in the 19th century, a lot of landscape painters were environmentalists. Thomas Cole certainly was, I think, certainly the members of the Barbizon school in France, who successfully agitated and got public support for the creation of a first national park in the world at the forest of Fontainebleau. So, and then that was repeated in the United States with the creation of Yellowstone in 1872 as a national park, which was spurred on by paintings by Thomas Moran, which helped the Congress of the United States to see the merit of national parks. So, you know, art was engaged in public life beyond just sort of making nice pictures of scenery. And so that's the challenge here. And the other thing too is that I don't want you all to think this is an art technique class. It never has been. It's about trying to develop a mindful practice of engaging with your surroundings through drawing and painting and writing, indeed, and to use that as a way of establishing a deeper connection between yourself and the environment, hopefully motivate you to care more about things like environmental salubrity, sustainability, and ecological civics. And which I think it's safe to say in our time is woefully lacking. So on to the lesson. So in the past 1, 2, 3 outings, we've been to Waterfall, we've been to Lake George, we've been to some great places. And today what I want to talk about is the idea of what happens when you're out in the landscape and all of a sudden a storm comes in, it starts raining, and you're forced to go back to the hotel. That doesn't mean you have to stop thinking about where you were and what you were doing. And so today we're going to talk about what do you do to continue that investigation, even though you're no longer in front of the subject. And let's say you've been like at a particular location and staring intently at this scene and measuring it and drawing it and planning a composition and laying it all out and thinking about what you're going to do next. And then all of a sudden you have to abandon the project, or at least abandon that aspect of the project, because either you're being attacked by wolves or polar bears, or there's a rainstorm, or what have you, that compels you to leave. Now, I should share words of wisdom by Turner, who often would go out into the field and just make sketches with his pencil and write verbally write color notes onto the page. And then he would go back to his hotel, open a bottle of Madeira, and then add color. So it wasn't always done on the spot. And this is a great thing to remember, that journal painting, or this approach, has a certain advantage over photography in that, if you want to take a photograph of something, you've got to be there. Whereas if you're drawing and painting and you've been studying a subject for a couple of hours before you had to bail out, you still have that memory and you can continue to unzip the file, even though you're not standing in front of the subject. So I'm going to review some of the steps that we studied before. Pardon me, I'm going to clear my throat. And I'm going to share the screen, and we're going to go over what you probably already know in terms of laying out a composition. Let's get the slideshow. Get over here. All right. So July 7th. Yes, that is today. Okay, so today's subject is a woodland subject on the edge of a lake. I had originally prepared a lecture, which I think I'll just post on the Sketchbook Traveler Basecamp website on my website, which you can watch later. And it talks about the history of this place and how we're in this maritime fossil reef, limestone, on the edge of Lake Champlain, how this area was important to Native Americans, also played a significant role during the Revolutionary War, the first 2 years of the Revolutionary War, and is where we were painting, where I was painting earlier, is also where a Haudenosaunee chief, an Iroquois chief, planted a peace tree during the Champlain tricentennial in 2009. So here's the subject, our motif. Now we're in a woodland, and we're staring out through a kind of natural window between two trees. And it's interesting how certain kinds of landscape suggest a pictorial experience. And there's a great book called Landmarks by Robert McFarlane, which is basically a narrative bibliography of landscape writing. And in it, he talks about this idea of doorways and windows in the landscape. So here we kind of have one. You can see this gap here. So we want to just go through the basic steps. First, we want to frame out our image. We want to decide where the left is, where the right is, where the top, where the bottom is. And that's going to be predicated on the proportion of the rectangle, the aspect ratio of the rectangle that you're going to be working on. So whether it's the size of your page or the size of the shape of the frame that you draw on the page, that is what you're going to have to use to capture, to decide what's on the left, what's on the right. Obviously here, I'm using this small tree, this young tree, as a kind of anchor point. And here I'm using these three trees, and you can see why. They line up on a diagonal. And so it's a natural kind of picture making opportunity. All right, so next step would be eliminate everything else and just concentrate on that. A little bit of zooming in. And I've lightened the photograph so that it won't compete with what comes next. Okay, so the next thing you do is look at the rectangle. I've gone over this idea before, spoken about how when I was teaching life drawing, the art students leaving New York, I would ask new students, what's the biggest thing in your drawing? They would say, the model. And I would tell them, no, it's the page. So you have to bear in mind that the biggest thing in your drawing is always going to be the page, the space. So the next thing you want to do is you want to divide, after you find the middle of that rectangle, you want to divide it into quadrants, into quarters. Now this is a symmetrical arrangement. The top mirrors the bottom, the left mirrors the right, and vice versa. Also, what's interesting is if you take a look at the proportion of each quadrant, it's the same aspect ratio as the mother rectangle, as the frame. Now, if we want to divide it into ninths, which creates a grid known as the law of thirds, what you would do would be draw a line from this midpoint to the opposite corner, and where it crosses this diagonal, make a mark. Repeat that process, and what you end up with are these 4 points. Now, if you look at something through the viewfinder of a camera, you're going to notice there are 4 points. And this is known as the law of thirds. These 4 points offer you alternative targeting points other than the middle. Most people instinctively, intuitively would put whatever it is they're going to be drawing right in the middle of the page. Of course, this is a recipe for disaster compositionally. You're going to end up with something boring that looks like a passport photo. And it won't have any sense of space, and it won't move. So you want to have some kind of symmetry for balance, but then you also want asymmetry for movement, for dynamism. And this is where we see the reciprocal overlay of the quadrants in red and the thirds or the ninths in blue. And lo and behold, the aspect ratio of each ninth is the same as each quadrant, is the same as the frame. So there's a kind of visual unity, and that's what's known as the armature of the rectangle. Okay, now, if we apply this to our composition, our image, we can see, you know, the middle in red. It's in red because you don't want to go there. And you want to look at where these 4 points coincide and see the horizon is slightly above the lower 2 points. There's a kind of alignment. If you look at these 3 trees on the right, they kind of line up with these 2 points here, which sort of lead us up to where this young tree on the left hits the top edge. So we begin, and also here, we can find from this corner to that corner, we can find certain alignments. This is going to be useful in helping us to actually lay out our image. So you want to establish the horizon, not because you need to know where it is, but you need to know where you are. What the horizon is in a drawing like this, or in a painting like this, is it is not the physical location of distant objects. It's your physical location in space in relationship to everything in view. Okay, the next thing you want to do is you want to take measurements. And this is just like drawing a model in a pose. So you have a model standing in a pose, and you want to know what's the distance between the top of the head and the soles of the feet. Well, one way of doing it is taking the height of the head from the chin to the crown and seeing how many times that goes into the standing figure. And that often is somewhere between 6.5 to 7 heads or 8 heads, whatever. I mean, there are all sorts of different formulas, but actually everybody's different. And some people are long-waisted, some people are short-waisted. But, you know, counting heads is one way to measure a figure. And so in a landscape, what you would do is take a distance between, let's say, the horizon and something else. Like, let's say, a horizontal passing below or through the trunk, you know, base of you know, the trunk of this young tree on the left. And so that white arrow, that white line with the arrows, that becomes like the height of the model's head. Okay, now turn it sideways. And this helps us to discover what the distance is from, let's say, this tree to this tree. And using this method, you can go top to bottom, left to right. You can pretty much figure out where things are. It's like latitude and longitude on a map. Any questions yet in the chat, Olivia?
Yes. Okay. Oh no, it wasn't a question. It was just someone making a comment about composition. She was traveling, so if there's any way you can make some points on it, please. Thank you. Okay. So I guess we're kind of working on that now.
Yeah, and James, there was a question from Martha, who missed the name of the book that you mentioned.
Oh yeah, the book it's a Scottish writer named Robert McFarlane, MacFarlane, and it's called Landmarks.
Ah, thank you.
It's really deals with like 6 or 7 authors, and it's really a narrative bibliography interspersed with these mini chapters, which are glossaries of local place names, mostly in the British Isles. But anyway, it's a very interesting book, and I highly
thank you so much.
Okay, and so the other comment about composition was, Olivia, I didn't hear it.
Oh, she said laying out composition. I was traveling, so anyway, you could please make some points on it, please. And I think we went over that just a little bit, so I don't know if it's quite relevant.
Yeah, the answer to that question is, first, you have to decide what's the scope of your vision, what's the scope of your view. The next thing you need to do is establish a horizon so that you know where you are, where your eye level is in relationship to everything else in space. Then the next step is to find some distance within that space that you can use as a unit of measure. The analogy I used was the height of a human head in life drawing. So, and the unit I used here, if you look at this slide that's up here now, would be this white, two-headed arrow. And then also that this is the distance also to the base of this tree on the far right. So you can measure like laterally, vertically, using that as a unit. You just do it like, holding up a pencil to, the subject like you would a model in a pose. Does that answer your question? Olivia?
Yes, Ranju said, was shaking your head, yes.
Shaking or nodding, okay.
Nodding, yes.
Okay. Okay, now, the next thing you can do is to try to find certain alignments. There's a famous quote by Thomas Gimbreed, who was the drawing master at West Point from, I think, 1818 to 1832, when he died prematurely. But he said, drawing is all straight lines and curved lines. Anyone can draw a straight line, anyone can draw a curved line, therefore anyone can learn to draw. So I think with that in mind, I think then at this point, you can begin to note these alignments, like the alignment of this tree, the alignment of this tree, this one angling in a bit more, this one angling out the other way, this one being more vertical. And as long as you know where all of these features are located, you can begin to give each an axis. The other thing you can do is to start trying to note some curves or arabesques, that help create movement. And what this is doing is this is letting you relate what you're looking at to your body. If you're thinking about measuring and just sort of verticals and horizontals and mapping quadrants and thirds, this is all very abstract and very cerebral. But the minute you start drawing curves, then you're beginning to make body-based movements and body-based marks. And it begins to humanize what you're looking at. And, but you should know the difference between something that's an idea and something that's a feeling. So I would say the curved line is more about the feeling, the straight line is more about the idea. And to try to be mindful of, which vocabulary you need to use at any given point in time. Any questions about that? No? Olivia, no questions?
I'm not seeing anything.
Okay, so if we remove the image, this is what we've got. And it looks very abstract, but at the same time, you can begin to imagine that there's a certain kind of space. We can see it again, like I pointed out at the beginning, there's this diagonal. There's this sort of horizontal that that is the edge of the bluff, and then there's the angle of these different trees and these different curves. Also, if you look at where the horizon line is, it doesn't fall exactly on the points denoting the law of thirds. And you want to be careful to do this. You don't want any of the elements of your composition lining up directly with a corner or some static feature in the compositional armature, the quadrants or the thirds. You want, because our eye will as human beings, we naturally measure what we're looking at. And so and this was another thing that I would talk about a lot in teaching life drawing, is that when people would make compositions, they would tend to have like the same intervals repeated over and over again in the composition, especially when they were focused on the object and not on the composition itself.
So, James, we did get a question in the chat. It was curved lines. How do you find them?
Curved lines. Well, you look for something that's moving through space in a curved way, like a tree branch, or the certain anatomical aspects of the human body too, curved. So, but like if we go back to this image, we can see that these tree branches, that this is sort of a descending curve. This is coming out, and of course you can see curves everywhere. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that when you're drawing a curve, you're talking about feeling. You're talking, it's a body-based move. It's not geometry. It's not cerebral. Henri Matisse had a good quote, and paraphrase it. He said, drawing is to the mind what color is to the senses. And I think it's an analogous thought, that when you're doing the geometry, or you're doing straight lines and axes, measurements, horizons, quadrants, thirds, so forth, that's all very conceptual. But when you start drawing curves, the body naturally wants to draw curves. If you pick up a pencil and make a mark on the page, most people, regardless of who they are, if you hand them a pencil and say, make a mark on the page, they're going to make exactly the same curve because of the anatomy of the human body. And that's a whole other conversation. But I think, you have to just use your judgment and see something like, oh, that's curving. So usually it happens because you're making straight lines to try to find axes. And then you say, wait a minute, that won't work here because that's curving. At that point, then you turn it over to your body and you start feeling. You move from the cerebral realm into a more a more thoughtful, intuitive realm. Okay. I need to get a glass of water. Hold on. So here we go. And that's it. So I'm going to take a break. I'm going to get a glass of water. And what I would like everybody to do would be to take a screenshot of this. You can work from this. I want you to follow along a little bit. And if you have paint, watercolor, or anything that makes mark with color, feel free to go get it. And what we'll do is we'll take a 5-minute break and come back. Any questions in the chat, Olivia?
Not right now. And if you guys do have any questions, put them in and we can ask them right as we come back.
Yeah, actually, when we come back, we can unmute people and they can ask the questions directly.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. All right. So let's everybody take a screenshot or capture this image somehow, because this is what we're going to be referring to.
Thanks, James.
Pleasure. All right. So we'll take a little a little break, and I'm going to leave the screen for a minute. Some water.
So while we're waiting for James to get set back up, I just want to let everybody know I put in the chat the link to the exhibition, Landscape Art and Virtual Travel, that inspired this entire series. And the good news is that it's been extended. It was going to be closing in August, but it is now being extended through February 6th. So we hope now that we're reopened and everybody can visit, we hope that you will do us that honor. James, welcome back.
It's a great show too. Everybody should try to see it.
And James is in it. So there you go. Of course. Thank you.
But yeah, there's a very interesting artist named Cynthia Daigneault who did this whole series of sort of this whole travelogue around the United States. Very interesting project, and sort of, like related, but she picked some more sort of canonical art places to visit, like Spiral Jetty in Marfa, Texas. But it's a great idea and really nice.
But it is a visual journal. I mean,
it is a journal. It doesn't. You don't have to paint in a book to be keeping a journal. I mean, it's the whole idea of a journal is more a practice than the species of object.
Yeah.
But when you're journaling, if you're journaling with like oil on canvas, then all of a sudden you begin to think, there's got to be an easier way than this. Less sticky and fewer bugs in the paint and so forth. So watercolor is a terrific medium to use, and contrary to popular belief, a lot of people say, "Oh, it's so unforgiving. It's such a difficult medium. It took me forever to learn what." It's like, no, it's just paint. It's just, you figure it's just like any other paint, except it's transparent. And frankly, I think that a lot of people who try to put out that narrative of it being such a difficult, unforgiving medium you know, they're teaching it like it's some kind of parlor trick, like it's a secret recipe that they've got. But I think plenty of people worked in watercolor. If you look at Winslow Homer, you know, he worked in watercolor a lot, but I think it was because he was traveling a lot too. But he didn't have, you know, any fancy techniques. He just built the painting up the way a lot of people do, with glazes and layering and using a razor blade every now and then to scrape things out. Oh, Sarah Linda, you might like this. Can you see this? Is this legible? Where is it?
You mean the water glass?
Yeah, can you read it?
Oh God. No, wait, hold on one second. I have to and see if I
Oh,
can
I'm
enlarge.
cured. Sorry.
Oh, I
I'd
see
have,
it. I see it has blue writing, but I can't tell what it is.
it's from the Thomas Cole House
Ah,
Gala.
the Thomas Cole House, what?
Virtual gala last.
Oh, from the gala.
They sent us glasses. It's a Thomas Cole National Historic Site cocktail glasses.
And was it filled with something?
Well, no, actually, we had to use our own beverages.
You know, that's the virtual life, right? Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah,
It's half the equation, so that's good.
well, there was that great series at the Frick Cocktails with the Curator, with that each week they would have a different artist and they would have a different cocktail. So they did Titian and they did Bellini's, or they did Bellini and had Bellini.
When they did Bellini, that I think that series, which was brilliant and so spontaneous but so well done, got a lot of us through the pandemic. Yeah.
Well, they did. I think they had more than 2,000 people on each Zoom. So
Right, deservedly so. They were wonderful. And now I can't wait to see the, you know, the new Frick, the new very
well,
exciting.
all right, let me get this other. Is everybody back in?
And do you want people to be
Right.
now?
Yes, I can make it so that everyone can unmute themselves freely to ask questions.
Thanks.
There should be all set.
That's great. Thank you.
So if you're back, so Olivia knows we can proceed. Could you just do like a hand up or something so that we know you're all back? I don't want to begin without everybody being back in the room.
See if we can see people.
Let me get this going.
I see people. Thanks to those of you who are responding.
I'm back. It's Amy. I can't find a hand
Hi.
up, but I'm here.
Okay, thank you.
Wait a minute, and then see if everybody.
Yeah, we're getting lots and lots of hands up. So it's perfect. Yep.
All right, well, welcome back.
Okay, we're gonna Zoom in a minute. Okay, so has everybody captured an image of this
Yes.
landscape?
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, I'm going to stop the share then. Okay, and I'm back now. Let's see. We've got the workspace here. Okay, I'm going to I'm going to show you this workspace because this is sort of, well, it's my workspace. And I've got the journal here. And this is the, again, the wonderful Golden Core watercolor set, which I highly recommend. And then this is just a Talon's watercolor palette. You can take tube paint and it has a little thumb thingy if you want to hold it like that kind of palette. And then a couple of pens in case I want to make some lines, and also a sponge. Now a sponge, where's the camera? A sponge is very helpful because you can wet it, you can tear a piece of it off, and it can be used to pick up some of the color you want to remove from the page. The other thing that's useful too is one of these, just a safety razor, because once you've mapped out your composition, there's no way to erase, but you can scrape, and it takes a little finesse, but you want to be very careful and just sort of shave a thin layer of the paper so that some of these lines that we use for mapping are not going to get in the way of what we want to do later. So you can take the razor blade, just simply hold it like this, and just keeping the edge flat on the surface of the page. You don't want to use the point. You want to just sort of go back and forth and either remove or lighten the mapping marks if you want to do that. I mean, there's an aesthetic reason why some people want to leave the marks, because part of the process. And as I would say to people, if you're going to be using a graphite pencil, do not erase, because if you erase an error and then you try to replace it with a correction, you're going to end up with another error. The best thing to do is, if you make an error with a graphite pencil, make the correction and then replace the error. Don't clean it off. A lot of people emotionally, they get unhappy, say, I don't like that, that's bad. They take it away and they do something equally unsuccessful. So you want to make sure the correction is done first before you remove the mistake. Okay. So let's zero in on this. Zero in on this. There, can everybody see that? Okay.
Yeah, that's visible.
So what we have here is we have basically a simple like layout of the composition. And you can see here the law of thirds, you can see the quadrants mapped out, you see the horizon right here. And then, of course, I use, the measuring to create the distances, and those other two trees are actually off to the side here. I decided not to use those. And then just to begin to lay down color, I just simply took a warm earth tone and laid it in under everything, like a yellow ochre. You could take a yellow ochre and just use that as sort of a base color. And here too. So now this is what I did in the field, okay? And now that I've been rained out and I've been driven indoors, now what do I do? Well, I've got plenty of information here. So how do I proceed, and how would I elaborate this? You know, I could think of warm and cool colors. So what I would do is, at this point, I've laid down some warm base tones, ground tones, okay? And without even consulting a photograph, I might just begin laying in some cool colors to try to create some kind of contrast and some sense of what's going on. Now, a lot of people will say, well, you can't paint watercolor over watercolor, which is utter and complete nonsense. There are plenty of people who glaze with watercolors. A wonderful artist actually does workshops too, Frederick Brosen, who teaches at the Art Students League of New York and has some private students who are well-known celebrities. And his paintings are all glazed. They're marvelous. So, you know, I could take and just, as almost memo to myself, you know, what am I doing here? I'm going to want to create some contrast between the ground and the water beyond, because, you know, it's, and at the same time, I'm going to want to be able to, and you see I'm painting wet over dry. I'm painting wet watercolor over dry watercolor, and it's not interfering with the color underneath. So that should be a myth buster moment for you all. The trick is, as you're laying down the color, to do it very lightly and to use the capillary action of the brush and not to scrub the surface, not to agitate what's underneath in any way. You literally want to drop the color on top of what's underneath. Okay. Any questions, shout out. Just ask.
So is the glazing kind of layering? Another layer on top of the old one?
Well, do you know how to glaze an oil paint?
Yeah, you use mix your paint with the medium, very more medium, less pigment.
Well, with oil paint, what you're doing is, you know, oil paint has its own problems. Oil paint, you have to paint fat over lean. That means that your first coat has to be very thin, has to be very have very little oil in it and more solvent. And and then as you build it up, you can add more oil and also more pigment. But yeah, but with watercolor, it's really a matter of just having a light touch and using the capillary action of the brush in order to just drop the color on top. It's not about, it's not, you don't want to be scrubbing, because that will distress and will reactivate the paint that's underneath. So
thank you.
Yeah, well, that's pretty straightforward. So now I want to try to begin to notice different kinds of things going on in the paint. So for instance, a sky, perhaps, you know, I can lay down a wash. And again, your goal here is not to produce a picture that looks a certain way. Your goal here is to teach yourself what you're looking at and to sort of remember, be able to remember what was there. You know, the difference between like looking at something and seeing it is that you don't see anything unless you understand it, right? So it's perfectly possible you know, it's perfectly possible to for students who don't read Chinese or Arabic to copy an Arabic inscription and still not be able to read it. You know, they might think it might just mean eat halal at Ollie's, but I mean, you know, it's possible to produce an image that you're incapable of reading. And what I want people to do is I want people to use this practice to try to teach themselves what they're looking at. So for instance, this peninsula back here is sort of an important feature. And I don't want to use local color. I don't want to take a green and paint it green. I mean, a lot of people do that. They say, oh, there's a tree. Where's my green paint? It's more important, I think, to think in terms of light and color as something that makes luminosity rather than just simply reproducing like a color swatch what you think the color is. Okay, so you can see that getting a little more color in here. Also, I could use a different kind of blue. Maybe I could say this area is sort of grassy. And I would say try to use as few colors as possible. Use, you know, like a red, a yellow, a blue, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, maybe a blue. Sometimes you can use black instead of blue, actually. And that's a very good lesson. So, and also when you're drawing like the terrain here, the foreground, you want to try to think about the undulations in the unevenness of the ground and try to map that out in your mind. So, and every time I go back, I'm going to sort of juice this contrast a little bit more. I'm going to give it a little more kick. Because at some point, I'm going to want to come in and make the lake more specific color. And I think in this case, it's going to be sort of more of a violet. The light changes all the time, so it's and you know, I don't want anybody to think this is not necessarily the way I paint. I don't paint the same way twice from one day to the next. you know, I've been doing this a while, so I don't have a recipe. But this seems to be a good way of explaining to people what they might want to be paying attention to. Now, at this point, I might want to bring a little more intensity of color, let's say, into this, like a wooded a peninsula, and inject a little more a yellow, a more intense yellow. And then here too, to try to create a more distinctive shoreline. If something gets too dark, you can always take a paper towel, you can always pick it up. So we're having a look across Lake Champlain to Vermont here. At this point, it might be necessary to start trying to beef up the contrast a little bit more with the trees. And this can be sort of slow going, you know, because you want to build the color up gradually. You also want to create, you want to maintain the idea of sort of warm, cool color relationships as being more important than like local color, what shade of green you think it is, because color is all relative. And so it might look like one color against one object. It might look like another color against another object. So you can trick yourself by trying to be too literal. And so at this point, I'm thinking about, okay, how do I get the feeling of being in a woodland environment, like looking out over this body of water. And perhaps in some areas where you need the contrast to be maximized, you just go with the dark, but you always want to build to the darks. You don't want to start with darks, certainly not with watercolor. So it's like gradually you're seeing, you're showing, and I'm not like looking at anything now, at any photograph. I'm just remembering, I'm trying to remember the rhythm of the trees and the branches and the patterns that they create. And then here thinking about foliage. It's a pine tree. And this is like painting from memory, and it's like a wonderful thing to do because it sort of is a way of testing your memory. And so when you go back out into the field, you can say, oh, now I'm going to pay more attention to that thing I couldn't remember, I couldn't figure out, like whatever it is. And that's an important like lesson to learn, I think. So
James, may I ask another question, please?
Sure.
So experience, in anywhere, with figure, with landscape, even with how do you paint an experience?
That's what we're doing. That's what you want to do. If you think you're painting an object,
Yeah.
you're wrong. You're not painting an object. What you're painting is you're painting your experience of that object
Okay.
as it is seen through this material practice of putting lines and color down on a surface. That's what you're painting. You're painting the story of that experience. And that if you look at Cezanne, that's what he's doing. There was a recent show of Cezanne at Princeton in which it was revealed, nobody knew, or they weren't telling us, that he had this keen interest in geology. Now you look at his work and how it's all fragmented and how it's all broken up. And it's like science. It's like looking at science, is fragments of hard-won certainty scattered across a great field of unknowing, but in a way that you can assemble it into a whole idea, you know, because science doesn't know everything, but with every new piece of information it gains that's reliable, then it's able to create a more believable story, you know, and that's the way Cezanne's paintings work. And I think that people mistook what he did as style, or rather they celebrated it as style during the 20th century. And of course that was I think that reading is going to go out the window at this point, because he's also as a practitioner, as a landscape practitioner, you know, he's got something to say about environmentalism. Any questions yet? So we could continue like this. You know, I've got this cluster of trees now that's looking kind of sort of plausible. And I could then reply on the other side. Pardon my reach. And again, intensifying the contrast perhaps. But the thing is, see, I'm glazing. I'm laying wet watercolor over dry watercolor, and it's not causing any trouble. So I can remember this bush. And you have to think about the way you're using your brush too, because it's like writing in a way. You have a different kind of stroke or mark for a different form. And there's a great Chinese watercolor painting manual called the Mustard Seed Garden. Is anybody aware of that? Do any of you know that book? Hand raise if you do. Any hands? Mustard Seed Garden Manual of Painting.
James, I'll look it up for everybody. It's the Mustard Seed Garden Manual.
Yeah, Mustard Seed Garden Manual of Painting. It was written in the late 17th century. It's basically Nanga. It's basically like literati painting from late Ming, early Qing dynasty, and pretty interesting book, because it makes it really clear that in China, at least, painting was seen as a form of writing. In fact, calligraphy in China is regarded as a higher art form than pictorial painting. It's a loftier it's like in the West, they think painting the figure is more creditable than painting landscape, although I would disagree. I've done both, and I think it's so. You know, the goal here is not to create something that's going to read like a photograph, but rather something that's going to resemble my experience. So I could take the razor blade, okay, and I could, and Winslow Homer used to do this. Look at his work. And I could open up some like white space in the page. And then what I could do is, and all this is really a lot of fun. I mean, I don't know, why paint if it's not fun? But I could take like a yellow ochre and I could just, even though the sky's already painted, I can, now that I've created this whiteness, I can just go and sort of like push that light color into those marks to create foliage. And also it gives the paper a different texture, you know, gives it a richness of texture that's sort of pleasant. Kind of nice, huh? So, you know, you could take the sponge and you could pick up some of that. Push a little blue in there. I don't know, you know, there's all sorts of things you can do. And at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is you're trying to create an experience, because that's what a painting is, or a play. The late Arthur Miller said that art is creating a structure for an experience. And I think he's right. So, you know, you're not going to reproduce the object. In fact, if you go back to the 19th century, you'll find that a lot of the art writers and so forth were very much opposed to excessive verisimilitude, because it was not exercising the imagination enough. It was just mere imitation. That the job of the artist was to elevate fact above data, to elevate the facts above the value as data. It would talk about certain kinds of painters being just mere imitation. Now, a lot of people who self-identify as realists pride themselves on this kind of like verisimilitude. And I think they got it all wrong. That just becomes craft. I think you have to, you know, if you're going to do a painting of something, or you're going to write a poem, or you're going to write a journal entry, it should be about what you care about. You know, it should be how you care about what you're looking at, right? That's the art. The art is not just being able to turn a form optically. That's just a parlor trick. And I know there are people who would be greatly vexed to hear me say that, but I'm afraid it's true. So, I don't know, you find your way. But I guess my point here is start light, start with warm and cool color, map everything out, know where everything belongs. And then you can find your way. Maybe I want to, a big space like this, you want to break it up a little bit, and I could see, for instance, here's a compositional opportunity. I see one. Everybody knows the work of Claude Lorrain, right? I've spoken about him. I could cast the foreground in darkness. And this is a Claudian trick called a repoussoir, which is, anyone here speak French? No?
Mais oui.
Wait.
Mais oui.
Qu'est-ce que c'est la traduction pour le mot repoussoir? Repoussoir.
I guess it's pushing to the back.
Yeah, shove. Yeah. Repoussoir. So you pay
Yeah.
with as add emphasis. Re adds emphasis.
Mm-hmm.
Poussoir means to push. And so repoussoir is like shoving. Right? So here's an idea. And I've just done this whimsically. I can push this back here. Make a little choke point there. This area in the foreground, which I could darken even further, building it up. This becomes what, in terms of art historical terms, talking about Claudian composition, Claude Lorrain would be called a repoussoir, and this means to shove. But what it is in practice is a diagonal, a dark diagonal, and you'll find this in a lot of paintings. You'll find this, a dark diagonal in the foreground that sort of acts as a barrier between the viewer and what's beyond, right? So now I have to figure out how to make this lie down. And I think just, so what this does is it leads the eye in like this. It comes to this sort of choke point here, which I could add a little more definition to. And so we go boom, and then bounce back this way. And I could even like pick it up here, put a little more darkness on the edge of this bluff. So this big shape that looks like sort of a dolphin nose. This goes in, this comes back. I could push another dark in here a little bit more. This could be sort of another. Anyway. Any questions?
Not really. It's nothing. It's just talking about French grammar in the chat from you guys.
Okay, correct me.
Clinton was saying pousser is the verb, I believe, and poussoir is the noun.
Right.
Pousser being the infinitive. Yep.
That would be correct. Je pousse, tu pousses, il elle
And so they call it,
pousser.
yeah, that's
Il-
right. That's correct. So a repoussoir is a noun. It refers to this device. It's a compositional term that refers to a shape, a dark shape in the foreground that has that shoves the viewer into the middle ground. So in other words, you sort of trip over this dark into this area here. And if you look at Claude Lorraine's paintings, it's all over the place. And if you look at, I mean, almost any 19th century, 18th century, late 18th, early 19th century landscape painting, you'll see that device being used over and over again. So, yeah, you're right. So it's, dommage, moi, pas le français comme Tarzan. So, the best I can do. Did everybody get that?
You're too humble.
Well, I can get by, but the thing is, my French is hilarious. I'll tell you a funny story. I walked into a, when I would go to Paris back in the 80s, I would always do two things. I would buy a necktie and a new pair of shoes, because the Parisians look at your shoes and they immediately think, oh, they're from Lyon or some horrible place. Because the Parisians hate the French. But then when they hear you speaking English, they think you're a Brit, and they really hate the Brits. But by the time they realize you're Canadian or South African or Australian or American, they can't forgive you because you've already fooled them twice. So I would buy a pair of French shoes, and I would buy like a purple tie or something, purple and green tie. So I walked into a shop and I said, quel bon magasin. Moi, je cherche une cravate de soie très branchée, parisienne. The guy showed me a few things. He said, oh, monsieur, vous parlez le français très bien. Vous êtes des États-Unis. He says, oh, incroyable. Vous êtes américain. Et vous parlez le français comme... I said, no, dommage. Moi, parle le français comme Tarzan. And he smiles at me, says, charmant, ma bonne chance, parce que moi, je parle anglais comme Jane. That doesn't get a laugh?
I'm laughing, but I was muted.
I said, the story goes, I went to buy a tie, and I was speaking my bad French, and I was complimented by the salesman. And I said, no, I'm sorry. I actually, it's a pity, but I actually speak French like Tarzan. And he said, oh, it's how charming. My lucky day, because I speak English like Jane. So there you go. Okay, any questions about any of this, any aspect of this? My French is pretty horrible. My Spanish is not much better, but any questions? You can unmute yourself if you want to.
So you were saying the diagonals, they project the space. Inner space.
The diagonals, look, watch. The diagonals,
Yeah.
you know, lead us into the space. Bump, bump, like this. Bump,
Okay.
bump. And then these other angles of the trees also serve a function like that to animate the space. what I was saying is that this dark triangle in the foreground
Yeah.
is a device that was sort of used a lot by Claude Lorrain,
Mhm.
who referred to it as a repoussoir. So yeah, it's a noun. It's a compositional concept. It's a device for moving the viewer into the space. It actually is an extension of the frame, if you think about it.
Mhm. Mhm.
Like instead of the frame being here, the frame is now here and it's angling in. Make any
Okay.
sense?
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Any other questions?
James, it's like, it's like you can invite people into your painting and they can find those diagonal pathways,
Well, that's
takes them into the composition.
right. That's the point. I mean, when I did a couple of other talks earlier on, we were talking about how to map out a composition.
Mhm.
That's what it's about. You're trying to create something that has balance, has beauty, but also has motion. And I would tell people that every painting prior to the invention of motion pictures, prior to the invention of cinema, was a moving picture, except the picture didn't move, the viewer moved.
Mhm. Mhm.
Movies
Yeah.
turned it around because you could, the 24 frames per second, you could simulate motion, and the viewer was static, but the picture would move. But now, if you look at a lot of, especially 19th century landscape paintings, Hudson River School, or the Germans or the British, a lot of them are doing composites where they're taking fragments of multiple places and putting them together into a fiction that only exists in the painting. You see this a lot, and it becomes a real problem, especially in when people are trying to identify where a painting was painted. And a lot of times, I mean, a lot of the paintings you'll see that are attributed to the Hudson River School, are like copies of engravings or something. They're not actually done on the spot.
Yeah. Well, that's how people found out about faraway places, right?
Exactly.
Engraving.
And that the print world, the print culture, really was like the internet. And and the other thing, artists today don't realize, people who self-identify as landscape painters, is they think like landscape is just a kind of class of imagery. But actually, if you think about it, the military topographers, the professional artists, the people who were doing illustrations for journals, naturalists, map makers, they all knew each other. They had to. Do you know why? They were not as siloed. Like today, we're all siloed. It's like painters are hanging around with painters, scientists are hanging around with scientists. But in the 18th century, 19th century, they all crossed paths. Where did they cross paths? Anybody know?
At, say, for example, Montmartre, the cafes.
No, that's later. They're crossing paths at the print shop. They're all working with the same engravers and publishers.
There's a wonderful book by William Ivins, who had been the curator of prints at the Metropolitan, called Prints and Visual Communication.
Yeah.
And that's really, particularly since most people couldn't read, that's how information was disseminated. I mean, Dürer did it, in the 15th century.
Yeah.
And then, and on and on and on. And then just think about like Rowlandson, for example. I mean, like comic strips, that's, it's a long, long history, but it's 3:03, James. I think, unless there are some other questions or comments, we
I
may
would-
have to wait till the next time.
are there any comments or questions? And Olivia, can you please? Thank you, Clinton. Thank you. Uh, could you save the chat and email it to me? And
Yes.
anybody who wants to reach out to me individually, it's really easy to do. You can go to my website, it's at james@mcelhinneyart.com, or I've just started a new Facebook page. It's a private page for students in these workshops. It's called Sketchbook Traveler Base Camp. And there's a Sketchbook Traveler Base Camp private web page on my website that I'm happy to email you the link to. And it's got all the videos from these workshops and from the Albany Institute workshops. So there's a lot of material there. And,
James, let me just let you know, at the beginning, I encourage people to send questions, comments, anything to you at workshops@newwatcher.com. Okay, so that's in the chat, everybody. That's like my first message. And I did want, before people leave, I want to let people know that the fifth and final session of this series, whether this is your first time or your fourth time with us, we love having you. And on August 4th, it's a Wednesday at 1:30, we will be having a professional critique of your watercolors. And James will share images of your works in the group in a slideshow, and everyone will have an opportunity to appreciate what others have done. To do that, just want to let you know that everyone who has participated in these workshops with James will have the opportunity to submit their work, and you will be mailed. We have your emails from your registrations. So you will be emailed Dropbox instructions 2 weeks prior to the program. And in addition, anyone who registers for that fifth session will be advised of the Dropbox link at the time. So if you need anything, let us know. Be in touch with us. Be in touch with James. We just love having you.
Yeah, it's not. This is, the word critique sounds judgmental and sort of intimidating, but what it will really be is just a discussion. Just share with us what you're thinking about, and we'll take a look at it and talk about the kinds of things that you're thinking about when you're journaling and painting and writing.
That's another one of those French words, right? Critique, that's come to mean.
Yeah, I
more
love
than
the
what it
fact
says.
that the British, the military artists would call it drawing on the spot. Love that. I think en plein air sounds a little bit too much like cuisine. I think I call it what you like, but no, we'd love to just have a discussion about you're all here because obviously you're interested in the subject, hopefully you're getting something out of these programs, but also let's it's kind of time to share what you've been doing, and so we can all talk about it and like learn from you. So
So thank you, James. Thank you so much for this and for inviting us into your dining room, which is beautiful.
I'm sorry I can't feed you all, but
you fed our soul, right, everybody?
ones and zeros are a little hard to translate into dining delights.
Well, once again, James, you're getting lots of kudos.
Great. Thank you so much for being here
Thank you,
today.
James.
It was really wonderful and inspiring. It's just
Yes.
great. You've opened up a whole new world.
Thank you. Well, I will post.
Thank you
this.
so much.
I will
Yeah.
Hi,
post
Sarah
this.
Lynn.
Thank you. I'm so proud of myself.
Oh,
I'm
good for you.
Proud of you
We're proud of
all.
too.
Thank you so much, James. And thank you all for being here. We'll see you next month, right?
I'll
Yes,
post this on the Sketchbook Traveler Basecamp Facebook page today.
good.
Thank you.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Wonderful.